Kalaris had been in the business of death for over 2 decades. He had eliminated targets across more than 40 star systems, infiltrated heavily guarded compounds, and even walked away from an attempted execution by the infamous T-Char syndicate without a scratch. He considered himself among the elite, a phantom whose presence was only known when the target was already dead. And yet, as he sat in the dimly lit briefing room of the Assassin's Guild headquarters, studying the holographic dossier floating in front of him, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Uncertainty. The contract was simple, at least on the surface. Kill Captain Elias Monroe, a human diplomat stationed on the orbital platform Nexus Prime. The payout was immense, well beyond what a single assassination usually warranted. That alone set off alarms in Kalaris's mind. A job that paid too well was never as easy as it seemed. He tapped his clawed fingers against the metal table, his glowing amber eyes scanning through Monroe's records. There was nothing remarkable about the man at first glance. 46 years old, a former military officer turned diplomat, responsible for a recent trade negotiation between the Terran Coalition and the Zyphar Dominion. Some alien factions wanted those negotiations to fail, fearing that humanity's growing influence would tip the balance of power in the galactic economy. Kalaris didn't concern himself with politics. He simply completed contracts and collected his payment. But something wasn't right. He scrolled further, looking through the Guild's archives for previous assassination attempts on humans. His frown deepened. The list was alarmingly short. Not because humans weren't high-value targets. They were. Yet almost every recorded attempt on a human had ended in failure. His claws clicked against the table as he narrowed his eyes. He had heard the rumors. Every assassin in the Guild had. Humans cannot be killed. It was nonsense, obviously. He had encountered humans before, and they bled like anyone else. The stories, however, were persistent. Contracts that failed without explanation. Assassins who vanished without a trace after accepting human targets, weapons malfunctioning at the worst possible moment. He wasn't the kind to believe in superstitions, but his instincts warned him that this mission would not be like the others. Shutting off the holographic display, Kalaris stood and strode out of the briefing room. The corridor outside was quiet, lit by the soft glow of embedded lights along the walls. He needed more information before committing to the contract. The Guild's database only provided limited details, carefully curated and often lacking the deeper, unspoken truths known only to those who had experienced the failures firsthand. There was one assassin, a veteran of the Guild, who had taken a contract on a human and survived. Kalaris knew where to find him. The lower levels of the Guild's headquarters were rarely visited by anyone of importance. The corridors were older, the air filtration slightly faulty, giving the space a damp, metallic scent. He moved with calculated steps, his boots making no sound against the steel floor. The door he was looking for was marked only by a number, 42. He pressed his palm against the scanner, and, after a moment's hesitation, the door slid open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, cluttered with personal belongings and stacks of datapads. A single figure sat hunched over a small desk, illuminated by the flickering blue light of a holographic display. Kalaris stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. "HFY," he said, his voice even. The figure at the desk barely moved, only shifting slightly to acknowledge his presence. HFY had once been one of the Guild's most renowned assassins. Now, he was a relic of the past. Retired, forgotten, and left to drown in his own failures. "I know why you're here," HFY murmured without looking up. His voice was rough, like stone grinding against metal. Kalaris remained silent, waiting. HFY finally turned his head, his eyes dull with age but sharp with something else, something that Kalaris recognized as fear. "You've accepted a contract on a human, haven't you?" HFY asked. Kalaris nodded once. HFY let out a slow, weary sigh. "Walk away from it." Kalaris frowned. "I don't abandon contracts. Then you'll disappear like the rest," HFY said, leaning back in his chair. Or worse, you'll learn the truth." Calaris crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "I don't believe in myths." HFY let out a dry chuckle. "Neither did I, until I tried." For the first time, Calaris saw something in the old assassin's expression that unsettled him. Genuine terror. "I had a clean shot," HFY said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The best rifle credits could buy, a vantage point that made escape impossible. The human never saw me. It should have been easy." Calaris listened, his sharp gaze locked on the old assassin's face. "But the moment I pulled the trigger, the rifle jammed," HFY continued, his eyes distant, reliving the moment. "I checked it later. There was nothing wrong with it. It worked perfectly the next time I tested it. But that wasn't the worst part." Calaris felt a strange tension settling in his chest. "The building collapsed," HFY said. "Seconds after my failed shot, the entire structure I was using as a sniper nest collapsed. I barely escaped with my life." Calaris narrowed his eyes. "An accident? That's what I thought," HFY admitted. "Until I looked into the others. Every assassin who tried to kill a human suffered something similar. Malfunctions, sudden accidents, guards showing up at the exact wrong moment. And those were the lucky ones." Calaris remained silent, considering the words carefully. HFY leaned forward, his expression grim. "Some never came back, and no one ever found their bodies." Calaris clenched his jaw. He had heard of inexplicable failures before, but the way HFY spoke made it clear this was something different, something beyond luck or coincidence. Still, he wasn't ready to walk away. He never did. "If what you're saying is true," Calaris said, his voice steady, "then what's causing it?" HFY shook his head. "I don't know. Some say it's a quantum anomaly. Others think humans are unknowingly protected by something beyond our understanding. Some believe," he hesitated before finishing, "that something watches over them." Calaris didn't respond immediately. He had never been a man of faith. He relied on skill, logic, and planning. But he had also lived long enough to know that not everything in the universe had an easy explanation. He took a step back, his mind made up. "I appreciate the warning, HFY." The old assassin sighed. "You won't listen, will you?" "No." HFY shook his head, a shadow of sorrow crossing his face. "Then I'll just say one thing." Calaris paused at the door. HFY's voice was low, almost a whisper. "If something goes wrong, run." Calaris left without another word. He had a target to eliminate. Calaris arrived at Nexus Prime under the guise of a traveling merchant. The orbital platform, one of the largest trade hubs in the sector, was an ideal location for an assassination. Crowded, chaotic, and full of blind spots. He had studied Captain Elias Monroe's schedule meticulously before departure. The man followed a strict routine, spending his mornings in his quarters, afternoons in negotiation chambers, and evenings at the diplomatic lounge on the upper level of the station. Calaris had chosen that final location for the kill, a public execution with just enough subtlety to ensure his own escape. The plan was simple: a well-placed toxin in the diplomat's drink, untraceable to any known species outside of the Zyphar Dominion, would induce cardiac arrest within minutes. No marks, no signs of foul play, a natural death in the eyes of any forensic team. Slipping through the customs checkpoint, he adjusted the collar of his coat, blending into the crowd of traders, tourists, and mercenaries that filled the station's main concourse. His posture was relaxed, his movements precise. He had done this countless times before. The diplomatic lounge was located near the station's observation deck, an upscale establishment meant for high-profile guests. He entered without drawing attention, scanning the room swiftly. Monroe was exactly where he had expected, seated in a private booth, deep in conversation with a fellow diplomat. The lighting was dim, the atmosphere laced with the scent of aged liquor and spiced air from exotic cuisines. Calaris moved to the bar, ordering a drink to maintain his cover. He barely touched it, his focus on the interaction between Monroe and his companion. His movements were methodical. He had already arranged for the bartender to receive a discreet shipment earlier that day. A small vial of the toxin, hidden inside an ordinary supply crate, had been seamlessly introduced into the bar's storage. The bartender, an unknowing accomplice, would be the one to administer it. All it took was a subtle signal. Caloris tapped his index finger against the counter twice. The bartender, a lanky Orvan with sharp reptilian features, nodded absently, unaware of the deadly substance he was about to serve. A glass of dark amber liquid was prepared, a drink Monroe frequently ordered. The bartender placed the glass on a tray and carried it over to Monroe's table. Caloris remained still, watching from the corner of his eye as the glass was set down. Monroe barely glanced up from his conversation, lifting the drink without hesitation. Then something changed. The moment the glass reached Monroe's lips, an unnatural static charge prickled against Caloris's skin. The lights flickered, just for a second, almost imperceptibly. A quiet distortion rippled through the air, like the fabric of reality itself had shifted. Monroe hesitated, his fingers tightened around the glass, his expression unreadable, and then, in an almost unnatural motion, he lowered the drink. Caloris's grip on his own glass stiffened. The toxin was undetectable. There was no way Monroe could have sensed it. And yet, something had stopped him. A moment passed. Monroe placed the glass back on the table, untouched. Then the unexpected happened. The bartender, confused by the inaction, reached for the glass absent-mindedly. The moment his fingers brushed against the rim, his entire body convulsed. He gasped, his eyes wide with sudden terror, before collapsing to the floor. The lounge went silent. Caloris's pulse remained steady, but his mind raced. Impossible. The toxin was species-specific. It should have only affected Monroe. The bartender wasn't even remotely compatible with the poison's design. Monroe rose from his seat as security personnel rushed in. He glanced down at the unconscious bartender, his expression calm, as if this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. Then, without another word, he left the lounge. Caloris didn't move. He had seen many things in his career, but this defied logic. The toxin should have worked. The setup had been flawless, but something had intervened. Mr. B went toward him, but had intervened. Adjusting his coat, he stood and exited the lounge, his mind already calculating the next approach. A simple poisoning had failed. That meant he would have to get close. Caloris moved through the corridors of Nexus Prime with calculated precision, his mind racing through every possible explanation for what had happened in the lounge. The toxin should have worked. There was no reason for Monroe to hesitate, no way for him to detect anything unusual, and yet he had not taken a single sip. More disturbing than that was the bartender's collapse, an event that defied both science and logic. The poison was designed to be undetectable, harmless to all species except its intended target. For an innocent bystander to react so violently suggested one of two things. Either there had been an unexplainable malfunction in the compound, or something had deliberately altered reality to protect Monroe. Neither option sat well with Caloris. His plan had been flawless, his execution precise. And still, he had failed. That in itself was unacceptable. But what unsettled him more was the lingering sensation that something had interfered. Not chance, not human intuition, something beyond his comprehension. The flicker of the lights, the static in the air, the way Monroe had paused, as if listening to a voice no one else could hear. It was not luck. It was something else. Caloris had never encountered a force he couldn't understand. He had spent years mastering every known assassination technique, adapting to different species' biology, weaponizing their weaknesses. But now, he felt as though he were blindfolded, moving against an enemy he couldn't see. He needed answers. His first thought was the station's security logs. If something unnatural had happened in the lounge, there might be evidence. glitches in the surveillance feed, anomalies in the station's energy readings, anything that could explain the moment of interference. His access to the station's mainframe was limited, but he knew someone who could bypass those restrictions. Vera Thal. She was a slicer, one of the best. An ex-intelligence officer turned information broker, she had built a reputation on Nexus Prime as the person to see if you wanted access to data that didn't officially exist. He had worked with her before, paid her well, and never betrayed her trust. That meant she would at least hear him out. Colaris navigated through the winding alleys of the lower district, where dimly lit pathways stretched between clusters of metallic housing units. The air smelled of overheated circuits and engine grease, the usual scent of neglected machinery. He found Vera exactly where he expected, in the back room of a repair shop that was more of a front for her actual business. She looked up when he entered, her violet eyes sharp with recognition. "You need something?" she said, not bothering with pleasantries. Colaris inclined his head slightly. "Security logs from the diplomatic lounge. Station cycle 463, unfiltered." She raised an eyebrow. "That's restricted access. What are you looking for?" He didn't answer. She studied him for a moment before exhaling in mild frustration. "Fine, it'll cost you." He placed a credit chit on the table without hesitation. She glanced at the amount, then nodded, sliding it into her terminal before pulling up the station's network. Minutes passed in silence as she bypassed the firewalls, her fingers moving rapidly across the interface. Colaris waited, arms crossed, scanning the room out of habit. It was a small space, cluttered with outdated tech components and half-dismantled drones. Then Vera cursed under her breath. Colaris looked at her sharply. "Problem?" She shook her head, her expression darkening. "No, just something strange." She turned the screen toward him, replaying the security footage of the lounge. He watched as the scene unfolded again, the bartender delivering the drink, Monroe lifting it, the flicker of the lights. And then, just before Monroe lowered the glass, the video glitched. It lasted less than a second, but it was there. A distortion in the feed as if something had momentarily disrupted the station's sensors. "That's not a normal error," Vera muttered. "The cameras are hardwired into the station's primary systems. For them to lag like this, something would have to interfere with the core processing." Colaris didn't speak. He rewound the footage, watching frame by frame. There, just as Monroe's fingers tightened around the glass, the distortion appeared again, an almost imperceptible shift in the space around him. "Enhance that," he ordered. Vera did, her brow furrowing as she slowed the playback. The closer they looked, the stranger it became. The air around Monroe wavered like heat rising from metal. But that wasn't the only thing. There was something else in the frame. Not a figure, not a person, just a presence. A faint outline, barely distinguishable, standing just behind Monroe's chair. It wasn't a shadow, wasn't a trick of the light. It was something that wasn't supposed to be there. Vera swore. "What the hell is that?" Colaris didn't answer. His pulse remained steady, but a realization settled in his mind. This wasn't just bad luck. This wasn't just a failed mission. Something was protecting Monroe, and whatever it was, it had made itself known. Vera looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Do you still want to go through with this?" Colaris didn't hesitate. "Yes." She studied him for a moment longer, then leaned back in her chair. "Then I hope you know what you're up against." He didn't. Not yet. But he was going to find out. Colaris left Vera's workshop with a clear objective. He needed to uncover what was protecting Elias Monroe. The security footage had revealed something unnatural, an unseen force that distorted the very fabric of reality. He didn't believe in spirits or ancient curses, but he had seen enough in his career to know that when logic failed, something else had to be at play. He had planned to kill a man. Now, he was chasing a mystery. The first step was finding someone who understood the Terran Coalition beyond diplomatic records. Official reports were sanitized, omitting the kind of details he needed. If humanity had some kind of hidden defense, someone outside the political sphere had to know. He turned to the only place where truth was whispered in hushed voices: the underworld. The Black Spire was a sector of Nexus Prime that few dared to enter unless they had no other choice. The station's enforcers rarely patrolled its lower alleys, and those who did either looked the other way or never returned. It was a place for smugglers, bounty hunters, and criminals, too valuable to eliminate, but too dangerous to trust. Kalaris moved through the streets with confidence, his posture making it clear he was not an easy target. He scanned the illuminated signs, searching for a particular establishment, a den where information was traded at a price. The Broken Chain. It was a small, unassuming dive bar, wedged between two failing repair shops. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning stimulants and old metal. The patrons were a mix of mercenaries, pirates, and exiled officials. No one looked twice at him as he made his way to the back, where an old contact of his, Lorik Drow, ran his business. Lorik was a former intelligence officer turned information broker. He specialized in secrets that governments wanted buried. If anyone had heard whispers of something unusual about humans, it would be him. Kalaris took a seat across from the aging Bracken, who barely glanced up from his drink before smirking. "Didn't think I'd see you again," Lorik murmured, his rough voice barely carrying over the music. "You never come here unless something's gone wrong." Kalaris leaned forward. "What do you know about human anomalies?" Lorik snorted. "Anomalies? That's a broad term. You'll have to be more specific." Kalaris's expression remained unreadable. "Unexplained failures, assassination attempts that never succeed, forces that interfere." Lorik's smirk faded. For the first time he looked up, studying Kalaris carefully. He swirled his drink, as if considering how much he should say. "There's a name," Lorik muttered after a long pause. "One I've heard whispered in classified channels. Project Paradox." Kalaris's eyes narrowed. "What is it?" Lorik exhaled sharply. "No one knows for sure. Officially, it doesn't exist. Unofficially, well, let's just say every record I tried to pull led to dead ends. Files that delete themselves, data that vanishes. The only reason I even know the name is because of old chatter from intelligence agencies that wanted access to whatever it was." Kalaris listened intently. "What do they say?" Lorik tapped a finger against the table. "They say humans are protected by something. Not just their military, not just their technology. Something bigger. Every time a major threat has tried to wipe them out, something goes wrong. Wars they should have lost, assassinations that should have worked. Like the universe itself is bending around them." Kalaris stiffened. That sounded eerily close to what he had seen on the security footage. Lorik studied his reaction, then leaned in. "And here's the part that should really make you think. Every government that's looked too closely into it, they stop asking questions, not because they don't want to know, but because something makes them stop. Either their investigations get buried, or the people involved just disappear." Kalaris clenched his jaw. He had never been one to fear the unknown, but this wasn't just about a failed assassination anymore. Who would have access to real answers, he asked. Lorik gave a humorless chuckle. "The people running the Terran Coalition's deepest secrets? Good luck, but..." He tapped the table. "There is someone who might have seen something. A former scientist who worked on classified human research. He dropped off the grid years ago, but rumor has it he's still alive. If anyone knows what Project Paradox really is, it's him." Kalaris stared at him. "Where is he?" Lorik smirked. "That's going to cost you." Kalaris slid a small data chip across the table. Lorik scanned it, nodding in approval, before pulling up a scrambled coordinate set on his wrist device. "His name is Dr. Adrian Voss. He used to work for Terran Intelligence, but he vanished a decade ago. Last confirmed location was an abandoned research station in the Voskar expanse. Kalaris memorized the data before standing. Lorik watched him go. "Be careful," he said. "Some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered." Kalaris didn't slow his steps. He had come too far to stop now. He was going to find Dr. Voss, and he was going to learn the truth. Kalaris piloted his stealth craft through the cold void of the Voskar expanse, his fingers steady on the controls. The journey had been long, taking him through abandoned trade routes and isolated sectors where few dared to travel. The coordinates Lorik had provided led him deep into uncharted space, where old orbital wreckage drifted in silence. His scanners picked up the research station before he could visually confirm its presence. It was a derelict structure, its hull scarred from age and neglect, floating like a ghost in the darkness. He maneuvered his ship closer, activating passive scans. No energy signatures, no external defenses, no transmissions. To any casual observer, the station appeared lifeless, but Kalaris had learned to trust his instincts, and something about the silence felt wrong. He docked manually, securing his craft to an auxiliary hatch. The airlock controls were unresponsive, forcing him to override them manually. The door groaned as it slid open, revealing a corridor coated in dust and flickering emergency lights. The station had power, but only just. Moving cautiously, he advanced down the hallway, his boots making no sound against the metal floor. His visor displayed minimal life support activity, just enough to sustain a single person. The walls bore faded insignias of the Terran Coalition's intelligence division, but much of the signage had been stripped away, as if someone had deliberately erased any connection to its past. The deeper he ventured, the heavier the air felt, thick with something unidentifiable. Not quite fear, not quite warning. Something deeper, something ancient. He reached a reinforced security door, its panel flickering weakly. He attempted to override it, but before he could finish, the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the chamber was filled with old data terminals, their screens dark, save for one at the far end of the room. A single figure sat hunched over the console, barely moving. His once pristine lab coat was worn, his hair unkempt, his skin pale from years without proper sunlight. Dr. Adrian Voss. Kalaris didn't speak immediately, observing the man's breathing, slow, deliberate, as if every motion required effort. "You're not the first to come here," Voss finally muttered, his voice hoarse. Kalaris remained still. "But I'll be the last." Voss gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "You don't know what you're dealing with." Kalaris stepped forward. "Then explain it to me," Voss exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "You're here because of the assassinations, aren't you? Because no one has ever been able to kill a human target." Kalaris nodded once. Voss's gaze darkened. "Then you've already felt it, the interference." Kalaris didn't respond. Voss looked past him, his expression distant. "We called it Project Paradox because that's exactly what it is. An anomaly that shouldn't exist." He tapped a control on his console and the terminal sprang to life, displaying old research files. Kalaris scanned the data, recognizing fragments of classified reports. Probability shifts, temporal distortions, cases where reality itself had bent to prevent harm from coming to certain individuals. Voss continued, his voice hollow. "We discovered it by accident, decades ago. At first we thought it was just luck, coincidences stacking in humanity's favor, wars we should have lost but didn't, assassinations that failed, disasters that spared key individuals. But the deeper we looked, the more we realized it wasn't chance." Kalaris studied the data closely. "What is it then?" Voss hesitated. "A force, a presence, something embedded within human existence itself. The universe does not allow their untimely deaths. It corrects itself to protect them, alters probability, creates impossibilities." He looked at Kalaris grimly. "It's why your attempt failed. It's why every attempt fails." Calaris's mind processed the implications. This was beyond biological advantage, beyond human technology. This was something woven into existence itself. Voss's expression darkened further. We tried to understand it. We tried to control it. The Coalition's top scientists ran experiments, some of them monstrous, to find its limits. But every time we pushed too far, something pushed back. Calaris narrowed his eyes. Pushed back? Voss's hands clenched. The researchers who got too close vanished. Whole facilities disappeared overnight. Files erased as if they never existed. We thought it was sabotage at first, but then we realized... He trailed off, his voice a whisper. We weren't supposed to know. Calaris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the station's failing life support. Voss met his gaze. There's something watching, something beyond science, beyond logic. It doesn't just protect, it enforces. Calaris exhaled slowly. Then why are you still alive? Voss gave a bitter smile. Because I stopped asking questions. A silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Then Calaris made his decision. He turned, heading toward the exit. Voss's voice stopped him. You're leaving? Calaris didn't look back. There's no contract anymore. Voss let out a slow breath, something between relief and exhaustion. Smart choice. Calaris stepped out into the corridor, his mind sharp, his instincts screaming at him to leave this place and never look back. As he reached the airlock, a final thought settled in his mind. Some forces in the universe were not meant to be challenged, and some targets were never meant to die.